All right, let's pick up where we left off. Andrew Johnson clashes with Congress. So Johnson is going to use the veto power like no president before. Remember, he kind of sees himself as this resurgence of Andrew Jackson. He is going to eclipse the Jackson veto power. He will use the veto on a variety of bills, the extension of the life of the Freedmen's Bureau. He vetoes the Civil Rights Bill of 1866. He's pretty racist. He has no interest in African Americans having any rights. He believes this is all up to the states. The radical Republicans especially are furious by this, and even moderates are not happy. But this is pretty insane, guys. He used 29 vetoes. Congress overrode 15 of 29. Very rarely do I say in this course, we'll probably never see this again, because it just ends up with me putting my foot in my mouth. I don't know if you see that again. I don't know if you ever see 15 of 29 vetoes overridden by Congress. But Republicans control both the House and the Senate. Remember? I mean, you have a very small number of Democrats. You have some Unionists in there too. So that 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate was pretty easy to override Johnson's vetoes. So, as we already know, before Lincoln is assassinated, the 13th Amendment is ratified in 1865. Lincoln was fighting for that in his last days of the first term. That freed all slaves in the U.S., and it was required, and even Johnson was on board with this, that all states upon re-entry to the Union had to ratify the 13th, as well as northern and western states who stayed in the Union during the Civil War. The 14th Amendment, proposed in 1866, but will not be ratified until 1868, guaranteed citizenship to all people born in the U.S. and provided equal protection under the law. Guys, this is one of our most important amendments. This is our Citizenship and Equal Protection of the Law Amendment. This ranks right up there with number 1 and amendments 4 to 8, right? When it comes to, we're talking about not taking anything away from other amendments. I'm just saying this is one that we hold near and dear. So the radicals, when putting together the 14th Amendment, they sought to instill some of the same ideas that had been part of the Civil Rights Bill of 1866. All African Americans were American citizens. If a state denied African American citizenship, its representatives in the Electoral College were lowered. Former Confederates could not hold federal or state office without congressional amnesty. This meant they had to apply for amnesty from Congress. And then the federal debt was guaranteed while the Confederate debt was erased. This is important, though, because that doesn't mean that, the Confederate, this does not mean that when the states re-enter, they are debt-free. In fact, when they re-enter the Union, they assume the debts they had before they left, right? This is actually going to be a really tricky thing in Virginia in the post-war era, because why is Virginia going to be upset about their debts? What has Virginia lost during the war?
West Virginia.
Very good. West Virginia, they're like, whoa. We're not paying all this debt. We got to readjust the debt, which we'll talk about later. Okay? Nice job. So, the radicals are disappointed that African Americans are also not given the right to vote. This is something they were really pushing for as early as the Civil Rights Bill of 1866. This is what's ultimately going to evolve into the 15th Amendment, which we'll talk about here momentarily. The 15th Amendment, though, is going to take some time, and the 15th Amendment won't be ratified until after Johnson's out of office. So, former Confederates will be required to apply for congressional amnesty. Virginia and other southern states, former Confederate states, are now going to have to hold conventions to rewrite their state constitutions, which will include the 13th and 14th Amendments. So, for example, in Virginia in 1868, they held what was called the Underwood Convention, where Virginia starts the process of reentry, but it's not made official until 1870. So I'm going to does anybody have any questions up to this point? All right. So on the left, we have the 1866 Civil Rights Bill. On the right, that's Judge John Curtis Underwood. He's the guy that headed up the Underwood Convention for Virginia to re-enter the Union. Bum, bum, bum. Johnson's impeachment. In 1866, after the first year of Johnson's term in office, radicals demanded the passage of the 14th Amendment, which won't become official until 1868. As election time approached for the midterms, do you all know what midterms are? Anybody know what a midterm is? In a presidential... Yes. Who's running for re-election? Not the president, but members of, you're on the right path, Congress. It just depends on what election cycle they're in. Not all of them. They're staggered, right? Some members of Congress are running for re-election. Some senators are running for re-election. Just depends on the election cycle. So the midterms, Johnson decides, you know what, I'm going to go out and I'm going to do this sort of whistle-stop tour by train, and I'm going to go out and just rip the radical Republicans on a campaign trail to try to get more support for Democrats and moderate Republicans. These are called the round-the-circle speeches. Well, the round-the-circle speeches ultimately turn into what are called give 'em hell speeches, because people come out to these campaign stops and start heckling Johnson. And he just gets more and more belligerent as this thing goes on, and the whole thing kind of backfires on him. Instead of him getting support for more Democrats or moderate Republicans, you get more radicals end up getting elected, and this almost makes Congress like, you know, a veto-proof branch of government. So the radical Republicans by 1867 have had enough. So they are going to set a political trap. And that political trap is called the Tenure of Office Act, which is pretty ironic on multiple levels. Tenure of Office Act basically said, and I want everybody to pay attention to this, that the president did not have the authority to remove members from the federal government, notably members of the cabinet. It's a little weird, right? This is kind of like an overreach for Congress. Because, and again, I think we need to give credit where credit's due. Historically, Congress is taking away power from the president, because in Article 2 of the Constitution, the president has the power to nominate their cabinet members. What branch of the government vets the cabinet members? The Senate. Very good. And then the president has the power to remove those people. Well, here's the irony of the situation. There's multiple layers of irony. How many of Johnson's cabinet members had he chosen? None of them, because Lincoln was assassinated. So he wants to remove one guy in particular, Edwin Stanton, who was Secretary of War, who actually arguably had as much power as Johnson had. He was kind of like the wheeler and dealer for the radicals, and he was like the internal spy for the radical Republicans. The other layer of irony here is Johnson vetoed the Tenure of Office Act, but the Republicans overrode his veto. The trap is set. The bait is Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War. Did I say Edwin Stanton a second ago? Yeah. Okay, good. And he removes Edwin Stanton, replaces him with one of Stanton's military enemies, Lorenzo Thomas, and the trap snaps. And now they've got grounds for impeachment. Often when you ask students, why do they impeach Johnson? Students will be like, because he abused the power, he abused his veto power. You can't remove a president for veto power. A president can issue as many executive orders and as many vetoes as they want. They have that power, whether people like it or not. So that's not grounds for impeachment. That was grounds for impeachment, but was it really constitutional? See where I'm going with this? So I don't want to paint the picture here that's like, oh, they did the right thing. This was a political maneuver, and it nearly worked. Didn't totally work, but it nearly worked. So on the left here, this is a political cartoon showing Johnson as a little boy trying to read the Constitution and the book flattening him out. The cartoon says, this little boy persists on reading books that are above his head. And then on the right, we have Edwin Stanton, the guy that he removed from office. Ulysses S. Grant, this is often referred to as the mystery man. They're using Congress as their cannon to fire at Lorenzo Thomas, the guy that replaced Stanton and Andrew Johnson. So, the hottest ticket in town, guys, the impeachment trial. Andrew Johnson not guilty. He is our first president that was put on trial for impeachment. How many times has this happened in American history? To date, 4 times. Johnson, Clinton, and Trump twice. Has anyone ever truly been removed from office? No. All 4 have been acquitted. All right? Will this happen again? Who knows? But Johnson is basically, this trial starts in March. It does not end until May. And when I say it's the hottest ticket in town, people are legit selling counterfeit tickets to watch this thing in the gallery. Like, it was all the buzz. Johnson ends up pleading the what? The 5th. Yes, he is pleading not guilty here, but he's going to plead the 5th. He has a dream team of lawyers. He's got a former attorney general, and he has a former Supreme Court justice on his defense team. They are arguing the constitutionality of the Tenure of Office Act. What really turns the tide of this trial, though, is it's going to be the radicals themselves. Had the radicals kept themselves composed, Johnson would have likely been acquitted. But what the radicals end up doing is they end up creating tension between themselves and the moderates in the trial, and this will end up flipping 7 moderate votes. He will be acquitted by 1 vote. And the 7 Republican moderates that voted for acquittal, their political careers are done. Now, Johnson, his time as president is pretty much toast. However, we already know the Republicans aren't going to nominate him in the first place because he's a Democrat. And the Democrats aren't going to touch him either. So he ends up going back to Tennessee. He takes a period of time off from politics, and then he goes actually back in and picks up a Senate seat at the end of Reconstruction. And then this is what gives the radical Republicans the opportunity to take control of Reconstruction. This is their time. So that is going to be Reconstruction by force. This is where we're going to pump the brakes today. Sound good? So in 1867, the Republicans now have a veto-proof Congress. The midterms worked out in their favor. They have unlimited control over Reconstruction. Now, do keep in mind the moderates and the radicals are going to remain divided. In fact, to make things even more confusing for a student of American history, the Republicans actually will now break into three factions. These are three factions that I'll be teaching you about when we get into the Gilded Age. So, in the Senate, the radicals are led by Charles Sumner, the guy who had been beaten by Preston Brooks on the Senate floor before the war. And in the House, from Pennsylvania, Thaddeus Stevens, staunch abolitionist, instrumental in the passage of the 13th and 14th Amendment. In fact, both of them are connected to it. So the radicals want the South they have a vision for the South. And that vision is both a political vision and an economic vision. The political vision is that the South is going to come back in on their terms. And their terms are going to be more punitive. They are going to have to pass the 13th and 14th Amendment, and ultimately they're going to have to pass the 15th. Economically, what do they want to see the South evolve into? What type of society?
Industrial.
Very good. They want an industrial society in the South that is not going to be dependent solely on northern manufacturing. They want there to be balance between agriculture and industry. Now, some parts of the South will grow industrially in the post-war era, but not all. All right? So this, guys, is the Reconstruction Act of 1867. Military occupation in the South. Think Hunger Games. All right? The South is put into 5 military districts. They will remain under martial law until they meet all of the demands of this act. So, tens of thousands of former Confederates are temporarily disenfranchised, meaning they lose their voting rights, and new guidelines are laid out for the readmission of states. This sort of wipes away Johnson's previous declaration that the South had met all of the demands that were required for them to reenter. One of the big pieces of the puzzle here, good point earlier, is the passage of the 14th Amendment. So everybody has to ratify the 14th, making all African American citizens, regardless of previous servitude. All states have to guarantee full suffrage voting rights to African Americans through the 15th Amendment. Now, the 15th Amendment is ultimately passed by Congress in 1869, ratified in 1870, but that's not going to be until what guy's president? Who's the next president? Union war hero. Grant. Very good. We're going to talk about him when I see you next. All right? Military occupation in the South led to widespread resentment, continued division. This is going to create a backlash that the radical Republicans don't really care about. But the South is going to dig their heels in here. So, by 1870, all of the states had complied with the standards of Reconstruction, and in 1877, the last of the southern states re-entered the Union. This is what we refer to as home rule. There's more to this story, though, and we'll get into it next class. So, this is the military occupation in the South. Virginia is District 1, Carolinas are District 2, Georgia, Alabama, and Florida are District 3, Arkansas and Mississippi are District 4, Texas and Louisiana are District 5. These are Civil War generals that command these districts. And the first date on the left is date of readmission to the Union. The second date is the return of conservative rule, like the reestablishment of home rule. If you're wondering why Tennessee is not in the military district zones, Tennessee re-entered the Union before all of this went down. They re-entered a year after the war ended. Top right, Charles Sumner from Massachusetts. Bottom right, Thaddeus Stevens from Pennsylvania. Sumner was the radical Republican in the Senate that pulled the strings, and Thaddeus Stevens was the radical Republican in the House that pulled the strings. And then, of course, this is the 15th Amendment, African American men receiving the right to vote. Do you guys have any questions up to this point? Is everybody good? All right, cool. So that is where we pump the brakes today. I've got a couple of things that I want to do.